for any reason, if you're visiting Washington, D.C., you want to know where to stay, you can contact me too.
That's all recorded.
I know. She will edit it. So, as I said, this work is informed based on my experience on food additives and food additive regulation. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the safety of food chemicals, what is safe, what are the legal frameworks in the United States, touch on cumulative effects and some opportunities for new strategies. So we, at least in the Western countries, most of our diet comes from processed foods. So these have a lot of convenience, but it also has some questions about how we make these foods, what we use to make these foods, and the sustainability of the system as well. So this is real. So this is the list of ingredients for this food that you can buy frozen in a store in the United States, and probably here too, that you put in the microwave, and it's a children's food. So if you count all these words, have as many words as the speech that President Lincoln gave at the end of the Civil War, roughly 500 words. So this is what we are dealing with. And this is just what is required to be labeled. There are more things in this food here that are not in this label, like chemicals that migrate from the packaging, chemicals that come from this film, chemicals that came from the processing of the food. So part of the work that I did with a few colleagues, we actually estimated that are around 10,000 chemicals that are allowed to be added to food based on the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. That is the agency in charge of regulating chemicals that are added to food. So these are chemicals that are ingredients. So all that list that you saw, those are ingredients because those are labeled. But then are also chemicals that are allowed to be used in packaging or during the processing of the food. So very briefly here, you have additives that are direct additives. Basically, those are added to foods on purpose for a particular function. You have colors, you have spices, preservatives, things of that sort. And then there are what in general is called food contact substances. So these are chemicals that are getting into the food in an indirect way, coming either from final packaging, or from the processing, these conveyor belts and these sort of pizzas, I guess. Cans, these plastic hoses filling the ice cream, etc. So there's a lot more than what you see on a package. That's the bottom line. So how do we know that the chemicals are safe? The regulatory framework for chemicals in food says that there has to be reasonable certainty of no harm. That is the safety standard for chemicals based on the US law. And basically, a chemical must be shown to cause no harm over the lifetime of an individual. So in this case, if you're a food company, you have to show that your chemical is safe before you're allowed to put it in food. So in short, a chemical is considered guilty until it's shown to be not guilty, or unsafe until it's shown to be safe. And safe meaning this, reasonable certainty of no harm. You cannot say something absolutely is safe, but there is a reasonable certainty that it will not cause harm. So the safety is evaluating using a risk or safety assessment method, looking into exposure, how much people are going to be ingesting this, and also how toxic or hazardous the chemicals are. The main focus of the standard is for individual chemicals, so one at a time. And also it's important that if a chemical is known to cause cancer in man or animal, must not be put in food, regardless of the exposure. The law is very clear, it's black and white. If it causes cancer, it's not allowed, period. The regulators don't like that. So for a safety assessment or a risk assessment, there are basically three components. There's a legal component with rules and regulations. There's a science component to generate the information that is needed when it comes to exposure or hazard. And there is also a public health component, because at the end of the day, we want to protect the public. So this is very briefly, I'm not a lawyer, but this is important to understand that the food law had two main purposes. One was to protect, or is still, to protect the health of consumers in the context of avoiding chronic diseases caused by chemicals that are added to food. And also was to advance food technology. The law passed in 1958, so it's 60 years old. And the law also says that FDA, when they do a safety assessment, they must consider these three components. One is the consumption. If people don't eat it or not exposed to it, not a problem. Safety or uncertainty factors. The data is not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. So we have to account for differences between species, differences within the same species, and some weaknesses of the data. And then this. It has to also account for cumulative effects of chemically related or pharmacologically related substances in the diet. This is not necessarily about mixtures of chemicals. The diet is a complex thing. It has not only the nutrients, but also all these extra things. And cumulatively, they may have an effect that could be dangerous. So I am going to focus a little bit more on what all these words mean. So this, as I said, remember, this is part of the law. It is included in the law in the US that you must consider cumulative effects of chemicals. So it's a quite protective law. Now, chemically related means that chemicals have similar structures. They belong to the same family. And in 2016, the FDA made a decision to ban a class of chemicals called perfluorinated, long-chain perfluorinated compounds. They banned them for uses in food and food contact materials like pizza boxes and microwavable popcorn bags and things like that. And in that decision, they used this OECD guidance for grouping of chemicals. So if the chemicals meet one or more of these 5 rationales, as OECD calls them, could be clustered together. They belong to the same group. So for instance, these are 5 different chemicals that are part of the same group because they all have the same functional group, right here. So all this could be looked at together. And these chemicals are part of a family called orthophthalates. So now when it comes to pharmacologically related, what does that mean? Again, it's in the law, it is in the regulations, but FDA never defined them. FDA also never defined chemically related. Only in that 2016 decision, we learned how they look at classes of chemicals. So the closest thing to a definition came a few weeks ago when FDA was explaining how they're going to deal with heavy metals and the exposure of children to heavy metals in food. And then they say that they will look at these heavy metals, lead, arsenic, cadmium, and mercury, that are contaminants. These are not approved to be used in food. So these are contaminants, but they are present in the food. And they will look at them together because they have effects on neurological development. All four of them. It's the first time that they actually express that these four different things, that they don't look alike, cause the same effect. So if that is the case, still not a formal definition of pharmacologically related, but if the biological effect is the same, how are we defining those effects? And how are we looking for? Are we, for instance, all organophosphates, pesticides, interact with inhibition of cholinesterase in the neurological connections here. Perchlorate, nitrates, thiocyanate, BPA, PBDEs, and other chemicals all affect the function of the thyroid gland. So this is not working well through different mechanisms, but all affect the function. Saturated fats or the artificial trans fats, all of them affect the cardiovascular system. These are just a short list of chemicals that we identified as affecting the development of the brain. And in addition then, if you have a thyroid gland that is not functioning properly, especially during gestation, the thyroid hormones are fundamental for the development of the fetal brain and young children's brain. So then you have, on top of what affects directly the brain, the chemicals that are affecting the thyroid that may be affecting the brain. So it gets very complicated and very messy. So we wanted to figure out if the information that FDA had in their hands for many decades, there was any indication that there were additives, those purposely added to the food, the so-called direct additives, that had any effect on on the brain or the hypothalamus or the thyroid. Any chemicals that could be affecting the development of the brain. And we did find in FDA's own database, and it's their own information, that there are 45 direct additives that contain toxicity data that could be affecting the brain, the hypothalamus, or the thyroid gland. So we look further because a lot of this data is very old. So we said, okay, there are now systems, screening systems, in vitro cells that you can run many chemicals at the same time very quickly in a system called high throughput. And we've looked into those databases to see if there were chemicals that affected the thyroid or some brain endpoints that were also food additives. So we identified 66 more that reacted with the thyroid hormone receptor in this in vitro testing. We also identified in the in vitro testing, in the screening systems, more than 100 food contact substances and 86 pesticides. So all this, in the worst case scenario, when you're having a really bad day, could be in your diet. So in the bottom line of that research was that there were 76 individual direct additives with similar functions. We looked at chemicals that are very common in foods, like flavors, preservatives, and sweeteners that are commonly found in a diet. So there are 76 of them that may be affecting directly the brain, directly the thyroid, and indirectly the brain, or both. So in this is just, I don't expect you to see this, to read it, but this is just to show you the list of chemicals, like aspartame, right here, it's a sweetener, that are in FDA's own database. All this is animal data in FDA's database. So this is, again, we published this lists of the chemicals that we found in the high throughput screening with affecting the thyroid receptors. So the bottom line was that we found more than 300 chemicals that are in the food that could be affecting the development of the brain. We don't know where they are. When we're eating them, we know that they have the potential to be in the diet, and we don't know in which combinations. And also, we don't know, or it's possible that each individual chemical may not be a problem, but when it's acting with others and affecting the same functions on the same organs, could become a problem. And we have no indication that these cumulative effects, that the FDA or food companies have ever done a cumulative effect analysis of these chemicals. So basically, the main problem here is that the safety assessments, the risk assessments, are done for each individual chemical, one at a time. So it is a chemical-centric approach where you look at one chemical, you put it on a dish, put cells in contact with it, or give it to an animal, and all you look at is how many organs in that animal are affected by this chemical in different doses. This is, in itself, looked like something interesting. We always like to have information. The problem is that even if that is the norm, we have so little information that it's hard to believe. So we did another study where we look at almost 4,000 chemicals that are directly added to food that FDA says need to be fed to a rat to see whether or not there's a problem. So in 2013, we found that only less than 22% of those were ever fed to a rat, just with the minimum or the most rudimentary test, that is, you have 10 rats and you look how many of those die. Not thinking about chronic diseases or anything like that, any kind of toxicology. So we looked at all the different type of tests that were done. Many of them were just how many rats died. Not a good health protective system. And that is not new. I mean, during the conversations before the law passed, FDA itself said that they only had information for half of the chemicals that they knew about in the 80s, in the 50s, I mean. By 84, FDA did another analysis of the information they had, and they found that only 10% of those additives have been fed to animals. Now, the other complicated thing here, or concerning issue, is that only less than 7% of these direct additives that are in foods were ever tested for developmental problems or reproductive problems. And that is quite concerning, since we are feeding this diet to our children. And pregnant women don't have a diet that is different from mine or any of yours. So that is concerning. So in total, direct and indirect additives, food contact substances, less than 40% of the FDA-regulated chemicals have any kind of oral feeding studies. So that was quite disappointing. So again, even if this is, for many people, a sound strategy, it doesn't work. It's a losing strategy to really protect public health. So, of course, we are losing. The consumers are losing. Public health is the biggest loser in this system. We also know that diet is one of the important reasons why we have so many diseases that have been increasing in the last decades. The so-called non-communicable diseases. So diseases that are not transmitted from person to person. So these have been on the rise for many decades now. And there is not just a problem of lifestyle or what we like to eat or not to eat or behavioral changes, but it's been demonstrated that environmental chemical exposures have also an effect on how our health is going to be when we grow up, especially when the exposures happen during development. So chemicals exposures are a big deal when it comes to the well-being of individuals. And there are multiple factors that are influencing the well-being of a person, from the genetic blueprint to the epigenetics to the socioeconomic status, environmental chemicals, air pollution, you name it. All these are actually responsible for how healthy or less healthy we are. And these are just some numbers. I'm going to go quickly through this from the US, and I have some data points for the EU as well. But just to demonstrate the enormity of the problem when it comes to neurological disorders. These numbers have changed just not like a couple of months ago. It's getting worse. There's so many children with some kind of developmental disability. There are children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder also going on the rise, autism spectrum disorders. There's specific information about chemicals that are, yes?
So you go back one?
Yep.
So how can you be sure that you are really kind of making properly those values? I mean, in the past, maybe people did not test so much for children with disabilities.
It is a possibility that is an overdiagnosis or an underdiagnosis. But there are some lines of evidence that indicate that this is more often, it's not a matter of being diagnosing more or with more sensitive methods to diagnosis. Some of these disabilities are pretty obvious. And this is some very small, very few data points that indicate that some chemicals have been associated with some of these disabilities. For instance, for heavy metals and organophosphate pesticides, it has been quantified the number of IQ points that are lost in young children that have been exposed to these chemicals. The heavy metals are the ones that give you the most solid evidence. Lead exposure, there is no question that is affecting the development of the brain, specifically when it comes to IQ. That is something that can be quantified. The phthalates, the chemicals that I mentioned earlier, have also been associated with intellectual development deficits. IQ points have also been quantified, and so on. Here you have some examples of developmental delays. Worldwide, again, this is between 10 and 20% of children with some mental health problems. In the EU, the numbers are similar to the US when it comes to developmental, emotional, or behavioral problems, and children that have been clinically diagnosed. So these are the ones that we know the doctors agree there is a problem, but there is a large number of children that don't have sufficient ways, that they don't demonstrate clinically what is happening, and it's what is called subclinical. And those numbers apparently, according to people that know way more than me, are even bigger than those that are clinically diagnosed. So that's what they call in the silent pandemic. These are just numbers for childhood autism. Here is Sweden, and this is from the 90s, and the dotted line here is the mid-2000s, and you see how the prevalence at 5 years of age or 10 years of age has increased from here 10% in the 90s to much higher percentages later on. So it seems to be a global issue. Same thing with diabetes. This is again in the US. Type 2 diabetes is known to occur in children. Type 2 diabetes is the disease of the adult, but it's happening in children now. So that one is also on the rise. Needless to say, obesity is also a tremendous problem, especially in the US. So how do we deal with multiple chemicals affecting the same organ or system? So the first step to deal with that is, how do we group these chemicals? We need to figure out a way. Is just the similarities in the chemical structure enough? Or do we need to look at something else? So EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, is in charge of regulating pesticides. And they have to do a cumulative risk assessment. So they have to find ways to group these pesticides to see how they are going to deal with them. So they put together a group of experts, and they try to identify or design a method to identify these chemicals. So they looked at different biological systems. They look at the nervous system, they look at the thyroid system for their interactions. They also look at reproductive systems. And they look at different, these are just examples of some of the parameters they looked at. And their thinking was that if any of the interactions or the alteration of the normal systems, how the organs work normally, are affected, there's a potential for a disease, an adverse effect of some sort that could impair, for instance, brain development. So the EFSA approach was very broad because they look at all the chemicals that had any effect whatsoever. They didn't care if the effect was bad, as long as it was not normal anymore. There was a shift from a normal state to an abnormal state. It didn't mean that the abnormal state was going to be a disease. It was just different, because they wanted to cast the broadest net. They didn't want any chemical to escape. So a broad net, any chemical that caused an effect was included. This approach is also consistent with a National Academy of Science in the US approach to the cumulative assessment of this. As you can see, there's a theme here, phthalates, on how to deal with them, with a group of them that cause problems with, in boys. And it doesn't focus at all on how the chemicals actually work, as long as the effect is similar. So using this approach, FDA actually identified more than 100 chemicals, 100 pesticides that had to be grouped together for evaluation of cumulative effects. So that was an interesting system. So if we put that in the context of our evaluation, we had identified this number of pesticides here that are actually directly affecting the brain, the thyroid, or both. So this is in the same publication we did with the direct food additives. So this would be an alternative risk assessment method, where you are looking at a health outcome, not a chemical affecting different organs, but you put a disease or a disorder or something that should not happen and see how many chemicals are affecting that. We need information. We need how to deal with this. We need a system. So basically, it would be grouping the chemicals with similar toxicity, gather information to figure out what to do with them, look at what is affected. If what is affected is the weight of a kidney or increase in hyperactivity, are two very different things. And do we really care whether the weight of the kidney will be a public health problem? Do we care, or do we know if hyperactivity and altered behavior is a public health problem? So there is a disconnect sometimes in the way the toxicity assessment is done in animals, where we look at things that we feel comfortable with without necessarily being relevant to diseases of public health concern, like obesity or like reproductive organ failures or neurodevelopment. So we need to start looking at endpoints that are actually of public health concern. We need to be able to integrate evidence that comes from different sources. So there is a movement, and here in the EU is by law designed, and for instance for cosmetics regulation, that you cannot use animals to do any testing. So the testing has to be done in vitro or through predictive modeling, but not animals whatsoever. So how do we integrate those new methods of doing a hazard assessment with animal data, with human data? So we need to be able to integrate the evidence that comes from all these different streams. And this is something that we've been thinking quite a bit about. I told you that we are now doing one chemical at a time. Now, those chemicals may or may not be in the final product. It could disappear when we make something, and new ones are created. So when it comes, for instance, to food contact materials, what is in your plastic bottles or in a food can, we should be looking at what is in the material itself, what comes out of the material, because that is what we really are ingesting, consuming, rather than the individual ingredients that were used to make that final material. So in our perspective, some of these things, or all of them, will reduce exposures, hazard, and lower health risks. So again, very briefly, how do we go about this? Again, grouping chemicals by similarity may or may not be important, but it would be important to look at them based on similar effects. We need to fill the data gaps. It's incredible the amount of information that we are missing. So there are different ways that this can be done without necessarily using animals. These are some examples. Again, we need to be able to look at endpoints that are actually of public health concerns. I don't care if the necessarily, the thyroid increased the weight or the liver increased the weight. Is the function altered? Is that kidney with a higher weight normal? It may be, or the function may not be normal anymore. So looking at more sophisticated endpoints. And again, the data integration is important. And the testing of the final material. So this is something new that we're exploring, and some people in Denmark are exploring, and some industries are exploring too. So when you get your pizza, or you put your popcorn in the microwave, or you eat your beans, each of these materials have a list of ingredients that were used to make it. But as I said before, some of this may not be here anymore. So this is an interesting experiment that was done at the Danish Technical Institute, the food division, where they actually took, I think it was a pizza box, and they extracted what was there in the material, in the cardboard. And they took that extract and they put it in contact with cells on a dish. And those cells could be looked at for estrogen receptor binding. It's modifying how the hormones work, for androgen receptor, for all these different endpoints. And this is, can look at this as a scorecard. So anything that is red here is something in these extracts from the cardboard had an effect on these biological systems. So on those cells that were here, something was happening due to the extract that was here. So that is an interesting approach. The opposite approach is when you develop a new material and you want to test not only the individual ingredients that you use to make the final material, but the material itself. So this is an example of a metal can epoxy resin. So what is used to coat the inside of a can so it doesn't rust, it protects the food, and it doesn't create any problems with the food or with odors or flavors or things like that. So if you can extract from this epoxy resin, from this can, and you put that through a chromatographer, and you get all these different peaks. These are way more than the ingredients needed to make the epoxy resin. And this is another one. So these are two different solutions that are used to represent foods. Fatty foods or alcohol-based foods, and this is for acidic foods like tomatoes and things like that. So there are many things here, way more than what was needed to make the polymer. And then these extracts were put again on a dish that had cells that need estrogen to proliferate. In the absence of estrogens, the cells don't increase in number. And that is what happened with the extract of this cell. If you look at this bottom line here, I know it's blurry and weak, but it's pretty much flat. So these are different concentrations of the extract, produce a flat line here. The number of cells that are on this axis did not increase. So the conclusion was the extract did not have any component that have estrogenic activity because the cells need estrogens to proliferate. So the last point I want to make is that, again, all these assessments are based on an individual. One animal, one person, one dish of cells. But we need to start looking at population effects, because 2 or 3 IQ points difference in a kid or an adult is not a big deal. When you're looking at millions of kids, the distribution curve starts shifting. So suddenly, what is a small shift in the IQ points, just a loss of 5 points, shifts the curve to the left, and you now have an increased number of children that could be qualified as mentally retarded. And there you have a big public health problem. So,
can I ask you, I cannot avoid reacting to the fact that it seems to be a very negative view. Personally, I think my consider if I should eat pizza. But the thing is that there needs to be a counterfactual, right? And there needs to be some sort of benefits. So
benefit of what?
of using some of these chemicals, and I mean, you're just showing the negative side. Is there a positive side? Or if you are telling that pretty much, I mean, many processes are restored, is there a choice when none of them are restored that is realistic? So what's the counterfactual here? We should have more chemicals, or how does it work? Because it's so negative in a way.
I'm sorry to ruin your afternoon. It's fine. You can eat pizza. It's okay. I'm not saying. I eat everything. I don't have dietary restrictions. I don't avoid anything. I work to make a system that is supposed to protect us all better. Because there are people that don't have access to even the basic foods because they live in food deserts, or they don't have the means to eat a healthy diet. So I don't reject any foods. I eat canned food, I eat pizza from boxes, pizza we make, pasta, you name it. My work is, let's make the system that is supposed to protect us all better, so we are all protected. Now, these chemicals, yes, many of them have a function. The epoxy resin that coats a metal can, it is important. It's preventing bacterial contamination. It is preventing food waste. Because you can leave a can in your pantry for 3 years. And 3 years later, you can eat that food and it will be okay. So there are beneficials. The US law says that when you are looking at the safety of a food additive, you must not consider the benefit of the additive. The additive has to be safe for human consumption. If it's not safe, even if it's going to save us from, I don't know, wasting food, it should not be used.
But then the
So,
question is, to what extent can we have chemicals that are going to be fully safe?
we are not talking about full safety. It's reasonable certainty of no harm. And the issue is that the system is broken. The system is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. That is actually testing chemicals to figure out whether or not they are safe for consumption for the entire population. I show you the DataGov slide where we have less than 22% of the chemicals have this much information. So something is broken. We need to have information to make informed decisions. I cannot just say because today is Tuesday, no, Wednesday, all the Wednesday decisions are going to be safe. All the chemicals or the evaluations that I do on a Thursday are going to be unsafe. So there has to be a process to figure things out. It's an evidence-based, science-based regulatory system. But it's not working well. There have to be ways to fix it, and that's what I'm trying to do with my research. And I understand that it's a downer, but I am not anti-chemical. I am for a full safety program that works for everybody. And protect businesses as well. Go ahead. I have just one more slide here just to finish up with the FDA concept. So in the US, as I said, the law is very protected. If you implement the law as it is written, I think we would be in a better place. So we or the regulators kind of forgot or are neglecting the cumulative effect of chemicals. We are on this simple system that is one chemical, one effect. We were the same with genetics. It was one gene, one protein, and now we know how much more. It's so much complicated. And I know that doing one thing at a time is very simple. It's much simpler than dealing with a lot of stuff. Again, the lack of information on effects during susceptible life stages. What happens during development is crucial. The Endocrine Society, there is a global science society, defines development as a one-way street. There's no U-turn to go back and fix what it didn't happen during development of a liver, of an arm, of an eye, of the brain. So we need to be cognizant that that is a very susceptible stage. So, and all these things, in my view, have, I think, there's considerable evidence that could be influencing public health. So, and these are just final thoughts that we really need to start looking at risk assessment in a more complex way, looking at the cumulative effects, looking at more than one chemical at a time, and taking special consideration to developmental stages. That's all.
Okay. So, thanks to everyone who has watched this live streaming. You see the next step. So now we turn that off and go for a question and answer.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
So,
just
Thomas.
We're going to switch on to recording now. So if you have a question, nothing's going to be recorded. Just make sure that was right now.